I wasn't really happy with my deck description for Hell at the start of my Hell Insane playthrough, and while I was going through the Zeus run, I realised it just made far more sense to just do it in 5 parts, where you do each of the 4 mythologies, and then at the start, you just spend like, I don't know, 15-20 minutes talking about the actual deck. So if anyone just wants a general idea of the deck, they don't want to have to watch the entire run, they just need to get the gist of it. Having just a deck description at the start was so much better. Also, it was kind of a mess. Like, I didn't really know what I wanted it to be, so I was all over the place. So I'm just going to I should say, redo the whole deck description, and just hopefully do a better job of it this time. But also kind of like keep to the point, make it more specific. Right, Hell is probably the goddess that I've got the most experience with by far. I picked her up. Kind of at the start of difficult mode, I unlocked the S tier Hell. She was the first goddess that I got at S tier, and I just thought the artwork was amazing, so I really wanted to stick with it. I don't think she's one of the strongest goddesses in the game. If you see the playthrough, like retrospectively I can talk about it, but in the playthrough you can actually see that when we get to Norse mythology, Hell struggles a bit, especially against Odin, who is, in my opinion, much stronger. Um, I don't know. I think it's good to give a general overview of how strong she is. I think it's useful to know. But I'm just going to talk about the deck now and stick specifically to what we're trying to do with it, the purpose of the cards, the switches you can make if you don't have certain cards. So I'm going to start with sort of like the card switches I'd make. If you don't have certain cards, I'm going to try and recommend a few swaps for you. So Decimation, destroy all deities and creatures. This is actually a pretty... Let's just change all these first. This is actually a pretty easy one. I would just take something like Seaquake, or let's just do this. Yeah, I would just take something like Seaquake, the Plague, anything, like any sort of big AoE would work just fine. Armageddon, any of these mass board clears would be pretty good. Arguably Armageddon might actually be better than Decimation. It really depends on your take on it, but I can't don't take Armageddon with Hell for goodness sake, because it resets Hell's status, which is why we're not using it. Decimation is still okay, but if you're gonna have a Decimation in the deck, also consider you need some sort of monument removal, because your opponent starts at one end of the board, you start at the other. If they put down like a 30 devotion Taisho, which is just going to destroy one of your units every turn, you need some way of dealing with that, which is why we've got Earthquake in this deck as well. Yeah, Hellas. Yeah. I'll go through it. What am I doing? I'll go through the switches first. So time reflow. I've talked about this in the Zeus deck. I'll probably just say this in every deck description when I'm recommending switches. But the whole thing about time reflow is it just allows you to replay a miracle that you've already used. So if you don't have time reflow, the obvious switch is just to get an extra copy of the miracle that you do have. So instead of having 3 Seaquakes, just add an extra copy of Seaquake instead of time reflow, or Eclipse, whatever you want. Talking of Eclipse, when you get your default deck, almost all the default, all the default decks really do. Even if you're starting right at the very beginning, the default decks tend to have Zeus Bolt in them, and Eclipse is really just a slightly more expensive Zeus Bolt, which also can destroy monuments. I prefer Eclipse. I think for only paying 2 extra devotion, Eclipse is better, and it just gives you that extra bit of utility. But just replace it with Zeus Bolt. It's really not an issue, and you definitely have Zeus Bolts by the time you... Well, basically you just have them. It's not really by the time. You could just get this almost from the start. Right, Soul Extraction doesn't actually require a switch. If you don't have it, it's not a problem. This is more kind of new players that are still trying to sort out what's strong, what's not strong. I have Soul Extraction in this deck purely because we are doing an insane mode run. And in insane mode, one of the advantages that your opponents have to make the game more difficult is that they start with bonus devotion. And Soul Extraction is just a way of saying, oh, right, well, Loki started with 8 bonus devotion. Soul Extraction. There we go. Okay, now you've got 0 devotion. We're back to kind of like an even field. They've still got a slight advantage, but if you have confidence in your deck, it's just one of those things that kind of can keep you in the game. I also think Soul Extraction is brilliant anyway. Occasionally your opponent doesn't have a play they can make, So they'll build devotion, and then for just two, devotion, you can remove all of it. Like there have been times where I've soul extracted like 20, 30 devotion because my opponent didn't have anything they could play straight away in their hand, and then it just took them down to 0, and that was it. Like they just had no chance whatsoever. Right, now now that we talked about like the obvious switches you can make in the deck if you're missing certain cards, I'm gonna talk about the deck overall. Yeah. Uh, Hell pretty much defines the whole deck because of the way she works. She sort of dictates exactly what can go in the deck, what can't go in the deck. Like I mean, you're never going to play Armageddon because it resets Hell. Hell herself, right? She's, I mean, she's one of the most sort of like mythology reliant goddesses there are. I mean, she needs Norse units to sacrifice in the first place, and her starting stats are absolutely pitiful. Like 60 health for a goddess is criminal. A Zeus could literally like put down 2 Minotaurs and then just Artemis arrow you like the turn after, Artemis arrow you the turn after, and that like you're in trouble straight away. Like by turn 3 you're in trouble. She is very very weak, and like 11-10 as well are terrible stats. 20 attack is very very unimpressive. Her opening stats. For example, if you compare it to Poseidon, Poseidon only costs 7 devotion to attack, and she has 30 attack, and she only costs like slightly more to move as well. Plus, she has 90 health, which is like, are you serious? But of course, Hell's advantage is she's susceptible to getting rushed, but the longer a game goes on for, the more likely she is to win. You can almost feel like her win percentage goes up the longer a match goes on for. She she is very robust as well, in so much as a lot of the counters your opponent might have, such as Seaquake or Decimation, don't really work on Hell all that well because Hell decks tend to be very kind of like thin on units on the board because she's sacrificing them all the time. You might have like a unit or two on the board, but you're looking always to like sacrifice and keep feeding Hell, making her stronger and stronger. So the deck itself is kind of robust. It's weak to getting run down, but if your opponent has a bad start, it's just possible that they just can't get into the game. Like they just cannot jump on you before you grow so big that they will never get over it. Right, I'm just gonna. So first, in terms of win conditions, Hell is one of your win conditions. She's a late game win condition. Eventually, it's going to reach a point where it costs her 4 devotion to move and 5 devotion to attack. And like her herself is generating so much devotion. This is another advantage of Hell. There is so much to talk about with Hell. I didn't realize how much there was to talk about with Hell until I started talking about it, and I'm like, oh my, this is actually going to take a bit longer than I realized. I was talking about how robust she is. The other aspect of that robust is, of course, because she's resistant to Seaquake and things like that. She's also resistant to elimination to some degree. Because if you use Hell's ability on a Fenrir, you get that devotion generation for the rest of the game. So once the Fenrir has been absorbed, like you can't Zeus bolt that devotion generation, if that makes any sense. It's now in Hell, and Hell can't be Zeus bolted. So that's the only way I can describe it, right? Like if your opponent has Seaquakes and stuff and they're getting rid of units, one, you're resistant to it. 2, once you've sacrificed a unit, you get its devotion generation, and Hell herself just starts producing like 10, 15, 20 devotion generation that will not stop until the game ends. Like you cannot stop that devotion generation. It's not in any unit that you can actually remove from the game without, like you have to win the game. Basically, that's all I'm saying. Is it's on Hell, and Hell herself is of course resistant because you can't destroy her with Zeus Bolt. Plus, of course, she gets health from sacrificing creatures. Right, Decimation. I'm just gonna like add a few of these together. Hell is resistant to Seaquake, as I've said like a million times. But the other side of that coin is she absolutely loves Seaquake. And Decimation is exactly the same. Like destroy all deities and creatures. All units take 30 damage. She loves this. Like these big AOE's, absolute like Earthquake too. Hell loves all of this. All right, it almost like if you had to rate it for Hell, Seaquake would be 10 out of 10. And Decimation would be like an 8 or a 9 because your opponent, has units on the board. You have units on the board. You decide you're going to use a Decimation, not a problem. You just sacrifice all your units, and then you cast a Decimation. All their units are gone. All that devotion generation they had is gone. You know, all that board presence is gone. But you've lost nothing. Like, hell has just gotten stronger. So, yeah, Decimation and Seaquake, 100%. If anything, like, 3 Seaquakes isn't enough. Like, 1 Devotion isn't enough. I've only got 3 Seaquakes because I've also got a Time Reflow. I quite... I was on the fence about having more, but I think that, like, 1 Time Reflow sort of works as, you know, like a mini Decimation, mini everything, basically. Eclipse, Seaquake, Extraction, Earthquake. You just, whatever you need, you can pull it out. Your graveyard suddenly becomes a bit of a toolbox. And 2 Devotion to, like, use your graveyard as a toolbox is very, very cheap. If anything, maybe I should have, like, 2 copies of Time Reflow. But the thing is, you need it in the graveyard in the first place, which means that, you know, like, you don't, like, Time Reflow is more valuable in smaller numbers. There's no point having 3 copies of Time Reflow in your hand. You know, that's just not going to help you, and it could screw you at the start of the game. I want my hand, especially at the start of the game, because I'm prone to getting rushed. I want to give myself the best possible chances of having a hand which is viable and that I can immediately, you know, like, get to work with, can immediately start building and immediately start sacrificing. So I decided that just, like, 1 copy of Time Reflow, because I must, like, you have to be really lean, I think. Like, she has to have, like, a really lean deck. She can't get carried away. You'll kind of see it with, like, almost everything here is very low cost. Like, Skoll is very, very low cost. Balder is low cost. The actual units are relatively cheap. Like, Fenrir is a 12 that produces 5. But truthfully, most of the time, we're actually just buying it. You know, we're using Tyr's ability to get Fenrir. So Fenrir itself, to some degree, you could say, is also pseudo low cost. So Fenrir, Tyr, Skoll, Balder, all under 10 devotion. Very, very cheap, very easy to get on the board. It's like, they're super important because you just want to get started. There is kind of a consideration to make, and that is just, let's just get them all here. I was considering, like, there are a few considerations, to be honest, but Sigurd is like the big consideration, right? Because, you know, 4 devotion, throwing it on the board for just 4 devotion is fantastic, and then that's a very easy kind of sacrifice for Hell to make. But I was kind of running into these weird problems where I threw everything on the board and then I had no hand. You know, like, there was nothing. And I suddenly had, like, odd amounts of devotion. I was in these weird situations where I was losing games because I couldn't, like, optimize. And I, like, Sigurd is super cheap, but it only produces 2 devotion a turn. And just, instead of 4 Sigurd, having 4 Skoll, Skoll just gives you 3 devotion. And the difference between 4 and 6 isn't normally massive. It's a little bit significant in that you can, with Sigurd, do, like, soul extraction turn 1 and put down a Sigurd. But it's not game defining, it's not super important, and I found it far more useful just having 3 generation over 2 generation, because that stacks up, right? Like, turn after turn after turn, 3 over 2, you're already making 150% more divine, more devotion generation from Skoll than Sigurd in the first place. I only have 1 copy of Freyja, and the only reason I've got Freyja at all is Heimdall. Isn't, like, Heimdall herself is, like, the perfect card for Hell. Like, I think this card must have been designed for Hell, because the whole thinking behind it is kind of like, for 17 devotion you put down 2 units, and it's like, of course Heimdall herself has 20 health plus whatever you want. In an ideal situation it's a Freyja, but just in general, just the ability to put down 2 units is normally more than your opponent can handle. And, you know, Hell is kind of like this little mini game where your opponent is trying to kill your units before, you know, that you can sacrifice them. They try and destroy them the turn they get put down, so you don't benefit from them at all. And Heimdall is almost like cheating in a way. It's kind of like saying, well, I'm guaranteed to get that kill next turn. I'm guaranteed to get that sacrifice next turn. Only 1 copy of Freyja, kind of similar to Time Reflow. I would love to have, like, Freyjas and Nidhogg's in the deck. And part of the reason that this deck struggles in Norse mythology is, against yourself, you really, really struggle. It's an uphill battle, because the type of hell decks you play against in Norse mythology tend to be heavier and greedier, and like their Heimdalls are bringing in Nidhoggs, Freyjas, all these things. Like it's just a heavier, greedier deck than you, and because you also are quite slow, you can't really like take advantage of that greed to get wins. So you're just fighting an uphill battle. But in all the other mythologies, you'd rather have your deck like this, like against the field, like against all the mythologies. If you just balanced it against all the decks, this is a better deck. You can't afford to be too heavy or greedy with hell, otherwise you're just going to lose too many matches. Like your win rate will actually drop if you go heavier or greedier. We've got a single Freyja because sometimes you can just afford it, but that 8 divine regeneration is amazing. The fact that it gives 10 maximum life as well means that sacrificing a Freyja actually means that hell got 20 health, not 10. And the 8 divine regeneration, if you can sacrifice a Freyja, a lot of the time it's just game over. Like that is too much generation on a hell. If your opponent doesn't kill you within the next 2 turns, there is just so much power concentrated into hell at that point. You can't do anything. So Freyja, to some degree, is a win condition. Hell is obviously the primary win condition, but if you can sacrifice a Freyja into your hell, that's like a subsidiary win condition, I suppose you could say. Iggy as well, I absolutely love. I've said before, I'll say it again. Like I wasn't a fan to begin with because I didn't really get it. Like an 8 cost that has no attack, can't do anything, is kind of pointless. But it's an 8 cost that has a devotion generation of 4, 30 health, and it makes all your other cards cheaper. And it makes a big difference. I mean, hell doesn't need its units to attack all that much. It's quite fine with just its units not being able to attack because it's going to sacrifice them anyway. So Yggdrasil really only has upside in a hell deck. In other Norse decks, not quite so much. But in hell decks, you can just sacrifice her. She doesn't need to attack anything. It's okay to have a card like this. Like it's absolutely 100% okay. I've talked about Seaquake. One of the things about Seaquake is that, of course, it hits everything, including you. So you're going to take like little bits of damage here and there. This is 30 damage. You'll take hits. If your opponent's using like Isis or something, then they'll tend to have stuff like the Plague or Prince's Plague. Or there might be a rock throw that goes through. Idun Tree is in here. One, because it's a monument, so it's immune to Seaquake. It's immune to Decimation. But 2, it just allows you to heal like those little nicks and scrapes. Like hell will just pick up like residual damage every now and then. If you're going to start spamming 3 Seaquakes, you kind of need like an Idun Tree just to kind of, deal with that. I mean, honestly, you can win games just by spamming Seaquake with an Idun Tree on the field, because 3 Seaquakes is 90 damage. So if you get an Idun Tree and you Seaquake, Idun Tree, get 10 health back, then you Seaquake a second time and a third time, the Idun Tree has healed you 20 to 30 health, and your opponent has just taken 90 damage, but you've effectively taken closer to 70 or 80 damage. And that's really only 3 sacrifices. Like hell, of course, starts at 60, but all you need to do is eat 3 units and you're at 90 health. And like that's actually a win condition. I've won before just spamming a Seaquake. And Idun Tree just does a lot. 9-5 is also kind of okay. Like it's not amazing, but it's okay. But it's mostly there because it's a very cheap monument you can throw on that's immune to all of your big AoE elimination and damage. And also, like, it's just in that respect, it does a lot. I'm not sure if you could really say like it's 10 out of 10 in any specific thing, but it's cheap. It generates 5 a turn. It heals you. It just does a lot for you. Eclipse I've talked about. Like, I think this is just a better Zeus bolt. I think paying an extra 2 devotion, but being able to remove monuments as well, super good. Yeah, Earthquake. Okay, like because you start slow, occasionally your opponent is just gonna throw down everything. Like it happens a lot in Greek mythology and Japanese mythology. Okay, like where they're just gonna like throw down like 3-4 monuments, like Hades statues, Zeus statues, all these cheap stuff. And sometimes you have to Earthquake. Hell just doesn't start that fast. You've got no choice at that point. Or the alternate is in Norse mythology or Japanese mythology, they'll put down a Wall of Asgard or a Taisha, which are both super inconvenient or super expensive, at which point Earthquake is just like a straight um, devotion efficiency move. You know what I mean? Like they just spent 30 on a Taisha, you spent 18 on an Earthquake. That's a 12 devotion gain you're making. Yeah, so that's the general idea of the deck. You can imagine it's kind of pretty simple in as much as I've gone through all the cards. You can see kind of the switches you can make. I don't think there's anything that's impossible to switch here, or like in normal or difficult mode, you really need to. Soul Extraction, I recommend if you're playing it on insane difficulty, but apart from that, is absolutely fine. Yeah, the general idea is just Hell wants her units to stay on the board just long enough that she can take full advantage, eat them, get stronger and stronger and stronger. The general battle plan is just kind of like to keep board clearing, keep your opponent as empty as possible, advance when you can. But in general, like if your opponent's just like throws stuff on the board, clear it. If your opponent's has something strong on the board, I haven't talked about Fenrir actually. I should just quickly talk about Fenrir because I forgot about it. Right, so Fenrir is kind of your early game hell. Like it's your backup option. You will win like a lot of games with Fenrir. It's surprising how many games you will win. But like a 7/4 that does 20 damage, that's fantastic value. That's 3.5 devotion per 10 damage. Just in the space of 3 or 4 attacks, it can finish a match. So all you really need is 21 devotion, and a Fenrir can kill a goddess. In the early game, when hell is absolute like this just isn't workable early game. Like 11 to attack, 10 to move. That's criminal. But Fenrir is nice and quick, and really cheap. Only 4 to move means that you can put it in some very annoying positions. If your opponent is throwing monuments down, then a Fenrir can often just like end the game, and you're kind of sitting back like, well, the game is over. Like I'm just waiting for it to end now. Like you just attack slowly. The 20 damage just means you're almost always like devotion efficient on the attack. They put down something, like a Greek temple or something at 8, but it's producing 5 a turn. You attack for 7. You've just made like 1 devotion gain plus what devotion generation they would have got. So before hell ramps up, Fenrir can do the same job if your opponent starts badly. This is one of your very few like early game weapons, but it is vulnerable. Like 30 health isn't really enough. It's it's susceptible to Seaquake itself, which puts you in little irritating positions where you'd like to keep the Fenrir, but of course you have to absorb it. But it's hard really to complain when you're getting 5 devotion generation. It just goes so easily from tier to Fenrir. And then you've got like a real piece. This is the only real piece apart from Hell that is kind of like a finisher for you. You either get to the late game, Hell is super strong and you just beat everything. Or in the early game, if your opponent starts slow or they're throwing monuments down but no units, suddenly Fenrir is on the board and just clears stuff and you grind them down very, very quickly. Right, perfect. I'm a lot more happy about that than I was about the initial description. I'm going to put this at the start of the insane mode run with Hell, and then I'll just tell you I'll put the deck list in the description, and then in the actual campaign, I'll just tell you to like skip to minute 6 or 7 or something, yeah? Just skip to the first battle. There's no point seeing that deck description again, but since I've recorded it as part of the Greek campaign, I can't really take it down. I'd have to like take it down and then clip it and then re-upload it or something. And my computer is not so great. It takes ages to upload anything to YouTube, especially like 2-hour videos. So